Hello and welcome. In this video we are going to take a quick look at how we can monitor disk space usage on our machines. So we're just going to look at several different commands that you can use to see how disk space is being used on the machines under your control. As an extension of this, we'll see how we can find out how much space is being used by specific users, how much space is being taken up in specific directories. Using these, well, they'll allow you to perform some preventative maintenance. You'll be able to monitor your machines to see, well, obviously how much space is being taken up, but if you then look at that again the next week, and the week after that, and the week after that, you can identify problems before they arise. You can see how quickly your space is being used up, so that you can plan that, gee, within the next 2 months, I'm going to need more hard drive space. Or I can address whatever it is that is using up all of this space, so that you can deal with running out of space before it actually impacts your system and the users on it. Now, the first of these is the df command. And this is going to give us at a volume level, for each of the volumes mounted on our machine, how much space it has available, and how much of that space is being taken up. Now, by default, it's going to include the name of that volume, the file system that represents the volume, how much space it has in total, how much of that space is currently in use, and where this volume is mounted onto your system. I'm using a slightly different machine for my demos today. You'll see it's called C7 Host, because it's got a slightly more interesting set of volumes on it than the typical demos that I normally use. So if we df, that doesn't quite fit on the screen properly. Let me expand that. Oh, I might have to shrink that one. There we go. So we can see for each of the file systems, including the temp ones, but we're really interested in the actual ones, how much space it has available, how much space it has in total, that is, how much of that is in use, how much is available, a percentage measure of how much of it is in use, and where this file system is attached into your file system as a whole. Now, you'll notice the space listings here are in 1 kilobyte blocks. That's useful, but we can make that a little bit more human readable by adding in one of -lowercase or -uppercase. Now, one of these is using they're both going to display this in more human readable sizes, so in megabytes or gigabytes or terabytes potentially. One of them uses the powers of 1,000, the other is powers of 1,024. So megabytes versus mega binary bytes. So if I say df-h for human readable, there we are. Instead of telling me that /home is, what is that, 41,000 1 kilobyte blocks, it now tells me that's 40 gigs. If we use uppercase H instead of lowercase, you'll notice it's slightly different. So the uppercase H is the powers of 1,000 instead of powers of 1,024 to go from kilo to mega to giga and so on. So it does appear a little bit smaller. Whichever one of those you decide to use, just make sure you're consistent. You can also, if you're interested, include T to give you the file system type, uppercase T, pardon me. So it just adds in an extra column so you can see, yeah, these are temporary file systems, that one's formatted ext4, that one's XFS, or whatever other file system you happen to have formatted those as. And being able to view this, we could say, look at the home directory, and right now it's using, well, my users are taking up 30% of the space available there. So that's not bad, that's pretty reasonable. I'm not terribly concerned about that. But suppose next week I do this and it's at 35. Not that big a jump, not a big deal, still nothing to worry about. But then when I have an automated script check this again the next week, it's at 40. And then the week after that, it's at 45, and then 50. That's a pretty steady increase that pretty quickly, within a couple of months, will lead to us running out of space. So if I'm monitoring this early, I can start planning, well, either A, where am I going to get some more space to allocate to this, or B, I can start examining what is it that is taking up all of that space. Admittedly, okay, 43 gigs isn't really a whole lot of space. This machine is just for a single user. You'll notice most of my space is actually allocated to a different volume. But, you know, if this was a, say, terabyte disk, and we're using up an extra 5% of that every week, that's something we may want to look into as to what is actually using up that space. In particular, if things like the root file system or the boot file system ever end up at 100% usage, your machine will stop being able to boot normally. You'll have to go into a rescue mode and remove some files in order to get your machine to boot. So watch out for that. And this command is very useful. It lets us see this, but it's not going to let us see within that volume what files are actually taking up all that space. This is just displaying it at a volume level. So we may have to explore a bit further. And that's where this next command comes in, du, for disk usage. It allows us to look at a directory and just get a printout of how much space is actually being used, what directories, potentially even what files are taking up all of that space. So I know from the previous command, var lib libvirtimages is at 99% usage. I want to explore this further. In the case of this volume, that really is just one directory. I set that up to host my virtual machines, to store the files that represent them, and predictably enough, I've used up the 100 gigs in doing that. So this one's easy to look at. I can just look in var lib libvirtimages. Wrong password. No, it was the right password. There we go. So we can see I've got several different virtual machines in here, some owned by root, some owned by QEMU itself. And yeah, some of these are, 20-ish gigs, 16 gigs, 20-ish gigs. So maybe I can do something to free up some space here. I have this machine, CentOS 4. No, that's not actually running CentOS version 4. It's my 4th CentOS machine. I haven't used this in months. Maybe this is something that I can archive and store somewhere else. Now, actually, the process of archiving that and making a backup and putting it somewhere else, that's not part of this video, so I'm just going to pause the recording and do that, and I'll be back in a moment. And I'm back. I have backed up that VM. I have deleted it, so we can now see it no longer shows up in that directory. Oh, I was trying to highlight, not resize. So CentOS 4 is gone, and if we take a look at the usage of that volume, it's now down to 78%. Still a little concerning, because it means I can only add one more VM, but I've at least dealt with the problem for now. Maybe I need to add more space to this machine, or clean up some more of these VMs that I maybe haven't used in a while, or just make them smaller. But that's a topic for another video. So dealing with that volume was pretty easy. It was a single directory, it was a single file that needed to be moved. But what about something like /home? There's going to be a number of users who have home directories in there, and who knows how convoluted those directories may be. We won't be able to just go in there and run an ls and parse through all those files. For that, we might use this du command that I was speaking about a few minutes ago. This displays disk usage. So it will display a directory, all of its subdirectories, and how much space is being used by each of those subdirectories. So this is somewhat useful for allowing us to figure out which directories are taking up the most space. To use this, it's du, and then we give it one or more directories to look in. So we could say, take a look in varlib libvirt images. Which shouldn't take that long to do. There's only 5 files in there, it's not that complicated. Oh, there we are. Not sure what took so long. So it's telling us for that directory, it is taking up, is that 75 1 kilobyte blocks. Again, that's not necessarily the most easily readable size, so we might add in -h to make this output more human readable. There we are. It's actually taking up 73 gigs. If we pass this a more complicated directory, like say /home, this is going to show us a significant number of directories and subdirectories, some of them probably hidden, and this will just be a significant amount of data to work through. But I can start trying to pick up individual directories and say, well, wait a second, that one's taking up 6 gigs. That's all measured in K, 21 megs, that's not anything to worry about. Well, I did spot the 6 gig one, which is the one that I'm mostly worried about. Everything else looks reasonably small. But yeah, even for just a few users, this is quite a bit to try to sort through. If you've narrowed it down a little bit more, for example, I know that my backups directory there, where'd it go? There it is. This user's backups directory is taking up 6 gigs, so maybe I want to take a closer look at that. So I could actually give the path to that particular directory, and I could add in A to display all the files, not just the directories. Because if I just display the directory, I'm just getting that 6.3 gigs that I was before. If I add in the A for all, now it's going to show me my files. And as you can see, that's where the backups of my VMs are. And yes, they're compressed, so they're only taking up 1 to 2 gigs as opposed to the 20 gigs that the full files represent. If we were looking up details of multiple directories, it will display, per directory, and since I included the -a for all the files, it's displaying information about each files. But I can also add in, if I'm displaying multiple directories, C, to give a count, a grand total at the end. Right now, I would have to manually look at this and say, okay, backups is taking up 6.3 gigs, images is 73 gigs. If I put in the -C, it displays this nice total at the end. Everything you've just looked at takes up a grand total of 79 gigs. So, again, very useful. Now, in this case, I already kind of knew where this space was being used, so I really didn't have to spend much time sorting through the output of DU. Realistically, though, on a machine that other users are using, you might be spending several minutes reading through that output, or maybe passing it through a sort command or something to find what's actually using up all the space. So you might also, or instead, use the find command. Now, I'm assuming you already know the basics of the find command. It's quite useful. In this case, I'm specifically going to look at this for finding files based on their size. So I'm expecting you already know find command, a directory, and then one or more of these search filters to, describe the types of files that you're looking for. So the file or the filter we're going to use is -size. That allows us to look at specific sizes. When we are typing in the sizes, it's going to be a number and generally one of these letters to indicate scale. So K for kilobytes, M for megabytes, G for gigabytes. So if I had not looked through my DU output and found that the /home or that backups directory for that user was taking up all that space, I might say find in /home -size. I happen to know the size that we're looking for, so if I say 16G, I am looking for files that round to 16 gigabytes. That's right, because they're not in /home. The ones that are in /home are, 2 gigabytes? Let's try that. There we go. There's a few of our backups that are approximately 2 gigabytes. If I wanted to find the 16 gigabyte ones, I would have to go through var lib images and reset the size to actually be 16 gigs. There's those files. What you'll notice is this is showing me CentOS 3, CentOS 1, but we already know from our output a few minutes ago, CentOS 4 was about 20 gigs. So what's going on there? When you use -size and you just specify the size and the scale, it's looking for files that round to that size. It's not going to look for anything bigger or smaller. If I want to search for something bigger, like maybe I wanted to see every file that was bigger than 10 gigs, I would put a plus beforehand. So plus 10 gigs. And there we are. Now I know that CentOS 1, 2, 3, and assignment.qcow2, those are all 10 gigs or larger. Actually, I should rephrase that. Those are all larger than 10 gigs. If this was something that was 10 gigs, we might not see it. If we go back to that home directory, I might be able to show this a little bit better. So if I said I was looking for something that was 2 gigs, we see CentOS 1, 2, and 3. If I say plus 2G, I'm looking for things bigger than that, things that don't round to 2G, things that would round to 3G. And we see my CentOS 4 backup. Oh, hey, there's a problem. This user has an ISO file in their downloads. They don't need to keep that. Maybe we throw that in temp. Maybe we throw that in some location where multiple users can access it if they need to. Or maybe we tell them, do a network install. Don't keep that ISO locally. You're using up too much space. So we could, now that we have found these files bigger than 2 gigs, we could go there and delete them and have a talk with that user about, playing nice with the other users and not taking up all the space themselves. Similarly, if you were looking for files smaller than a certain size, you could say minus 2G. I'm not going to hit enter on that because there will be a lot of files that are smaller than 2G. Maybe I could say smaller than 2K, or maybe even smaller than 1K if I'm trying to find files that are potentially empty. Like, I guarantee you, well, almost guarantee you, original.txt there is probably an empty text file that I could just go delete. Though I would certainly check on that before I did. So we've just looked at 3 commands that fulfill similar purposes but slightly different uses. They are all going to allow us to look at our disk usage, to look at our machine and find what is using up all the space and which users are using up all of that space. So the df command is nice, but it's at a very high level. It's telling you at the file system and volume level how much space you have, how much of that is in use. If, again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, if we start monitoring that over time, we can get a good idea of how fast that space is being used up, so we know how quickly we need to react. We, can see in a month I'm going to need more storage, so I can start dealing with that now. But, again, that doesn't tell you at a specific directory or file level what is using up that space. du does that. It allows us to, not just a home directory, but look at any directory that we have access to and see of it and its subdirectories how much space is being used up. So we can start tracking down who and what is using up all of our space. And find, there are many, many more options for find that I didn't look at, but the one we did look at allows us to locate files based on their size. So we can say, something is using up and increasingly using up all my space. Let's look for all the files that are bigger than 10 gigs, bigger than 2 gigs, bigger than 1 gig, whatever. You could also, using some of its other options, you can look for files owned by a specific user. But that's a whole different video. So this is really useful to track down which individual files are using up all of my space. So, what we've looked at in this video is a few commands that we can use to monitor and manage our disk usage. There is, of course, more to this, but this is a good introduction to it. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.